A man in Houston spent 22 years working in logistics management. By 2023, his total lifetime earnings had crossed $1.4 million. His net worth at 51 was $63,000, mostly in a savings account he hadn't touched since 2019. He isn't an outlier. The Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances shows that roughly half of all American households between 45 and 54 have a net worth below $246,000. Strip out home equity, and the invested portion for the typical household in that bracket drops to somewhere around $100,000 or less. Most people look at that and blame income. But that's not what the data shows. The households sitting below the threshold aren't predominantly low earners. They're people who made real money and spent most of it in ways that felt completely reasonable at the time, which raises the question that nobody asks cleanly. What exactly is absorbing the income? 4 specific forces. Not bad luck, not bad character. Structural mechanisms that the consumer economy has built directly into the path of every raise, every car purchase, and every financial decision that feels responsible on the surface. That's what this video is about. And every year those forces go unnamed, they keep running, quietly, automatically, against you. My name is Alex, and if you've ever made more money than you ever expected to make, and still felt like you were barely keeping up, stick around, because the explanation is more specific than you've been told. I'm going to show you exactly why high earners miss the $100,000 investment threshold, and the 4-step sequence that finally breaks the cycle. Once you understand where the money is actually going and why, you'll make your next financial decision from a completely different position than you made the last one. The story of that Houston logistics manager, and the moment everything shifted, starts with a number most people track religiously and a number almost nobody checks. The scorecard nobody taught you. Here is something worth sitting with for a second. Most people can tell you almost exactly what they earned last year. Very few can tell you what they kept. That distinction between earning and keeping is the entire game. And the reason most people never learn to track the second number is that nobody ever told them it was the one that actually mattered. Income is a flow. Money comes in, money goes out. Net worth is what remains when the flow stops. It is the only number that tells you whether 20 years of working has actually built anything. And for a large portion of American households, the honest answer to that question is uncomfortable. The Federal Reserve conducts a survey of consumer finances every 3 years. The most recent data, released in 2023, is still the most comprehensive snapshot available of what American households actually own and owe. Here is what it shows. The median net worth for Americans between 35 and 44 is $135,000. For the 45 to 54 bracket, it is $246,000. For 55 to 64, $364,000. Those numbers might sound reasonable until you run them against what that same household has earned over the same period. Someone making $90,000 a year from age 30 to 55 has grossed $2.2 million in income. And the person sitting exactly in the middle of their age bracket has a net worth of $364,000, much of which is home equity. Strip that out, and the liquid investable portion for the typical household in that range is closer to $150,000, $2.2 million in, $150,000 remaining. That is not a math problem. That is a structural one. And here's the part that surprises most people. The households below the median are not predominantly low earners. They are people who made real money consistently for decades. The money passed through. It just did not stay. Let me make this concrete. Take 2 people, call them Daniel and Greg. Same age, same employer, same base salary of $90,000 a year. Daniel decides at 40 that he is going to channel $1,500 a month into a low-cost index fund, regardless of what else is happening. Greg puts in $250 a month, which feels responsible, and spends the rest on things that seem reasonable: a newer car, a nicer apartment, a few trips that went on the card. 10 years later, at a 7% annual return, Daniel has approximately $260,000 invested. Greg has approximately $43,000. Same income, same decade. The only variable is the monthly delta, multiplied by time and compounded. That is not a story about discipline or sacrifice. Daniel did not suffer. He made one specific structural decision and automated it. The gap between those two outcomes is entirely explained by that single choice, repeated automatically every month for 10 years. Now, this is where most people pause and think, but I do not have $1,500 a month to invest. And that reaction is worth examining because it usually means the monthly budget is fully committed, which means the flow is already fully absorbed, which means the scorecard, if anyone is keeping one, shows income going up and net worth barely moving. That is the pattern. Steady income, rising lifestyle, flat or slowly climbing net worth. And the uncomfortable truth is that it feels fine from the inside, right up until it doesn't. The median 55-year-old with $364,000 in total net worth has roughly 10 years until traditional retirement age. At current averages, they will need somewhere between $1 and $1.5 million to sustain their lifestyle without working. The gap between where they are and where they need to be is not going to close on its own. And the reason it opened in the first place was not income. It was four specific forces that have been running quietly in the background against every paycheck, every raise, and every financial decision that felt completely reasonable at the time. The four forces that erase every raise. Nobody sits down and decides to stay broke. That is the part that makes this so frustrating. The people who never cross the $100,000 invested threshold are not, for the most part, reckless. They are not gambling their paychecks away. They are making ordinary decisions, the same ones everyone around them is making. And those decisions are quietly, systematically working against them. There are four specific forces behind that, not personality flaws, structural mechanisms. And once you see them clearly, you will recognize every single one. The first is lifestyle creep. It is the most common and the least dramatic, which is exactly why it does the most damage. Here is how it works in practice. A project manager named Claire gets a $12,000 raise. She has worked hard for it, and it feels like a genuine win. Within the next few months, she upgrades to a one-bedroom apartment closer to the city, $4,000 more per year. She leases a newer car because the old one has high mileage, and the payment feels manageable, another $3,600 a year. The restaurant budget quietly shifts. The weekend trips get a little nicer. By the end of the year, the raise is completely absorbed. Her savings rate is identical to what it was before. She earned more. She kept nothing more. This is not a story about weakness. It is a story about defaults. In the absence of a specific, pre-committed decision about where a raise goes, the consumer economy makes that decision for you, every time. The second force is payment thinking. And this one is particularly worth examining because it is built directly into how major purchases are marketed. A $42,000 SUV at 7% financing over 60 months is $630 a month. That number sounds manageable. It even sounds responsible. Reasonable monthly outflow for a reliable vehicle. What it actually is, you will pay just over $47,000 total for an asset that lost roughly $11,000 in value the moment it left the lot. Currently, the average new car loses close to 20% of its value in the first year. The payment felt fine. The math does not. And here is the deeper problem. That $630 a month, invested at 7% over 5 years instead, would be worth roughly $45,000. Payment thinking does not just cost you the interest. It costs you the compounding on what you would have built. The third force is asset confusion. This is the one that tends to affect people most in their 40s and 50s, because by then they have accumulated things: a house, a car, furniture, maybe some jewelry or equipment. Those things feel like wealth, and sometimes that feeling is accurate. Often it is not. An asset puts money into your pocket. An index fund does that. A rental property does that. A primary residence, the one you live in, does not. It might appreciate, but it also costs you property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and the opportunity cost of the equity sitting inside it. Calling your house your biggest asset is technically true and practically misleading at the same time. The distinction that matters is investable net worth. That is the number that actually works for you while you sleep. The fourth force is delay, and at 40 or 50, this one lands differently than it does at 30. At $750 a month invested at 7%, crossing $100,000 from zero takes approximately 8 years. Start at 42, you cross it at 50. Start at 50, you cross it at 58. with 7 fewer years of compounding remaining on the back end, where the growth is fastest. The cost of delay is not linear. Every year removed from the compounding window costs more than the year before it, because it eliminates a year from the period when the balance is largest and growing hardest. These 4 forces are not random. They are the path of least resistance in a system designed to convert your income into someone else's revenue. The only exit is understanding where the exit actually is. And there is one specific threshold that changes everything once you reach it. The threshold, where everything changes. There is a number that does not get talked about enough. Not a net worth target, not a retirement goal, not a salary milestone. A specific invested balance that changes the underlying physics of wealth accumulation, not metaphorically, but mathematically. And most people either never reach it or reach it without realizing what just happened. That number is $100,000. Charlie Munger said it plainly. The first 100,000 is a bitch. He was not being dramatic. He was describing a mechanical reality that anyone who has tried to build wealth from zero will recognize immediately. The early stages feel disproportionately hard relative to the progress they produce. There is a reason for that, and understanding it changes how you think about everything that comes before the threshold. Here is the math. At a 7% annual return, which is a reasonable long-term estimate for a diversified U.S. equity portfolio after inflation is accounted for, $100,000 generates $7,000 in growth per year, without you doing anything, without an additional contribution, without a single decision. That is $583 a month that your existing balance is producing on its own. Now that might not sound life-changing in isolation, but think about what it means in the context of building. Before you cross 100,000, every dollar of growth in your portfolio comes almost entirely from what you put in. You are the engine. The compounding is there, but it is modest because the base is small. After you cross it, the balance itself becomes a meaningful co-contributor. You're still putting money in, but now the money you already have is also pulling weight. The engine is no longer just you. This is why the timeline accelerates the way it does. Contributing $1,000 a month at 7%, it takes approximately 6.5 years to go from 0 to 100,000. That is the grind phase. The phase where it feels like the account barely moves, despite consistent effort. Going from 100,000 to 200,000 at the same contribution rate and return takes approximately 4.5 years. The dollar gain is identical at $100,000, but it arrives faster because the existing balance is now compounding alongside the contributions. Going from 200,000 to 400,000 takes approximately 6 years. The calendar time is similar to the previous leg, but the dollar gain is double. $200,000 of growth in roughly the same period it previously took to produce 100,000. The math is not speeding up because you changed anything. It is speeding up because that is what exponential growth does once the base is large enough to matter. Let me put a face on this. Take a nurse named Sandra, 48 years old, who crossed 100,000 in invested assets this year. She keeps contributing $750 a month. At a 7% return, by the time she is 63, standard retirement age, her balance will be approximately $400,000. That is not a fortune, but it is a position. It is the difference between arriving at retirement with options and arriving without them. Now consider what happens if Sandra had waited 5 more years to start building seriously, crossing the threshold at 53 instead. Same contributions, same return. By 63, she has approximately $220,000. The delay did not cost her 5 years of contributions. It cost her nearly half her outcome, because it removed 5 years from the period when the balance was largest and compounding hardest. This is the thing about the $100,000 threshold that most people miss. It is not just a milestone to feel good about. It is the point where time starts working with you instead of against you. Before it, you are racing to build a base. After it, the base begins to carry some of the race itself. That shift does not happen by accident. It happens because someone made a specific sequence of decisions, in a specific order, and held to them long enough for the threshold to arrive. That sequence is shorter than most people expect. The 4-step sequence. Most financial advice fails not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. It tells you what to do without telling you what order to do it in. And with money, the sequence matters as much as the actions themselves. Doing the right things in the wrong order can set you back just as effectively as doing nothing at all. There are 4 steps. They are not complicated. What they require is specificity, not inspiration, not motivation, not a personality overhaul. Just a clear decision about each one, made once, and then structured so it runs without relying on willpower every month. The first step is eliminating any debt carrying an interest rate above 7%. This is not optional, and it is not negotiable. Here is why. A credit card currently charging 22% interest is a guaranteed 22% loss on every dollar sitting in savings or investments while that balance exists. No investment strategy reliably beats 22%. The S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% annually over the long run, less after fees and taxes. Trying to invest your way past high-interest debt is like filling a bathtub with the drain open. The math simply does not work. The debt has to go first. This is also the step most people resist, because paying down debt feels invisible. There is no account balance going up, no number to watch grow. But eliminating a 22% liability is the single highest guaranteed return available to most households. It just does not feel like investing because the benefit shows up as interest. You stop paying rather than a number that climbs on a screen. The second step is building a cash floor. $10,000 in a high-yield savings account, currently yielding around 4 to 4.5% annually, held specifically and only for emergencies, not for opportunities, not for a car you were planning to buy anyway, for the event that would otherwise force you back into debt. This step exists because without it, every financial setback reverses months of investment progress. A transmission failure, a medical bill, a gap between jobs, any of these can wipe out a year of careful saving if there is no buffer in place. The emergency fund is not an investment. It is structural protection for the investments you are building. Think of it as the thing that keeps one bad month from becoming a 2-year setback. The third step is automation, and this is the one that does the most practical work. People do not successfully save what they intend to save later. The research on this is consistent, and the intuition matches lived experience. When money hits a checking account, it tends to get spent. The only reliable exception is money that never arrives there in the first place. A 401k contribution, that is your employer-sponsored retirement account, that moves before your paycheck clears is not experienced as a sacrifice. It becomes the new baseline. You adjust to what you have, not what you almost had. The same principle applies to any automatic transfer to a brokerage or index fund set to move the day after payday. Automate it, and it happens. Leave it to a monthly decision, and it mostly does not. This is not a character observation. It is just how budgeting actually works for most people operating under real-world pressure. The fourth step is the hardest, not technically, but socially. Spend less than you earn, and make that a specific number rather than a vague intention. A household earning $95,000 that commits to living on $68,000 and investing $2,080 a month has a mechanism. A household that resolves to save more when possible has a wish. Those two households will look completely different in 10 years, not because one is more disciplined, but because one has a structure and the other is relying on willpower. Willpower is exhaustible. Structure is not. The honest thing to say about this step is that the difficulty is not personal. It is environmental. Consumer culture is specifically designed to make spending feel like the natural response to earning. Every raise comes with a social pull toward a visible upgrade. Resisting that pull is not about being frugal. It is about being deliberate. The person who makes $2,000 a month disappear into investments before the lifestyle has a chance to absorb it is not sacrificing anything meaningful. They are just deciding on the default can. And once that decision holds long enough for the balance to cross the threshold, something on the other side of it becomes possible that was not possible before. What the threshold actually buys. People talk about financial freedom like it is a destination, a number you hit, a moment you arrive at, and then everything is different. That framing is not quite right. And the way it is wrong actually matters because it causes people to aim at the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. The $100,000 investment threshold is not a finish line. It is a change in leverage, and understanding what it actually buys, specifically, not abstractly, is what makes the grind of getting there feel like it has a real purpose. rather than just a distant promise. Here is what $100,000 in invested assets does in practical terms. At a 7% annual return, it generates $7,000 in growth per year without any additional contribution. That is not a withdrawal. That is not income you are taking out. That is the balance growing by $7,000 while you are at work, while you are asleep, while you are doing something else entirely. The money has started doing a job you did not have to show up for. Now, layer contributions on top of that. Take a teacher named Paul, 52 years old, who crosses the $100,000 threshold this year and keeps putting in $750 a month. At a 7% return, by the time Paul is 65, he has approximately $390,000. He contributed roughly $117,000 of that over those 13 years. The remaining $173,000 came from growth, from the balance compounding on itself month after month, without Paul making a single additional decision. That is the shift. Before the threshold, almost everything in the account got there because Paul put it there. After the threshold, a meaningful and growing portion of the balance is arriving from somewhere else. The account is increasingly self-propelled. Now consider what happens if Paul had waited just 5 more years before crossing it, reaching $100,000 at 57 instead of 52. Same contributions, same return. By 65, he has approximately $210,000. The 5-year delay did not cost him 5 years of contributions. It cost him nearly half the outcome, because those 5 years were not just any 5 years. They were the years when the balance was largest, compounding fastest, doing the most work. This is the part worth sitting with. The further into the compounding window you are, the more expensive each year of delay becomes. At the beginning, a delayed year costs you a small amount of early growth. Near the threshold, a delayed year costs you a year of accelerating momentum. The math is not uniform across time. It gets heavier toward the end. But here is the dimension of this that rarely gets discussed, and it might actually be the most important one. The $100,000 threshold does not just change the math, it changes the decisions available to you. A household with $100,000 in liquid invested assets evaluates a job offer differently than a household with none. The person with the buffer can afford to say no to something that pays well, but costs them in other ways. They can take a month between roles without going into debt. They can absorb an unexpected expense without it becoming a financial emergency that unravels months of progress. They have, in a very practical sense, bought themselves options that did not exist before. At 55, this distinction is not theoretical. It is the difference between the next decade being one you chose and one you endured. The difference between staying in a job because it makes sense and staying because you cannot afford to leave. That is what the threshold actually purchases. Not luxury, not early retirement necessarily, just the ability to make the next major decision from a position rather than a corner. The roughly half of American households that never crossed this threshold, people who earned enough, worked consistently, and made decisions that felt reasonable the entire time, did not fail because of income. They failed because 4 forces ran quietly against them for 20 years, and nobody ever named them clearly enough to interrupt. Understanding those forces, at any age, is still the beginning of something different. And what comes next? What to actually do with wealth once it crosses the threshold, is where most people make an entirely new set of mistakes. The money moved. You just couldn't see where. Here is the central realization this video has been building toward. The households that never cross $100,000 in invested assets were not underpaid. The money was there. It moved through, absorbed by lifestyle creep, payment thinking, misidentified assets, and the quiet mathematics of delay. 4 forces running automatically against every paycheck for decades. 3 things worth carrying forward. First, income and wealth are not the same measurement. Confusing them is where the gap opens. Second, the 4 forces are not personal failures. They are structural defaults, and they only stop when a specific decision interrupts them. Third, the $100,000 threshold is not a symbol. It is the point where the balance begins pulling its own weight, and where your options quietly expand. Take a moment to think back over your last 2 or 3 raises. Where did the money go? Not approximately, specifically. If the answer is unclear, that is the most useful place to start. The next question, what to do with invested wealth once it crosses the threshold, and why the most conventional answers to that question tend to work against the people following them, is the one worth staying for.